And it's not just sheer distance that enables Thoreau to mount that critique over the fence line of his neighbors. By making himself at home where the ants are making themselves at home and where the mice are nibbling his dinner, he takes a lesson in the way nature sometimes pushes back, resists our dreams and our demands. Like the loon that engages him in a game of chess on the surface of the pond, only to checkmate him with a laugh when the storm rolls in. Thoreau makes use of this natural resistance when he titles his greatest essay, Resistance to Civil Government, echoing the distinction drawn by his Puritan ancestors between the civil and the natural, but reversing it so that in Thoreau's telling, it's civil government that's fallen and natural government that resists its moral injustices, so that Walden Pond, just on the edge of town, becomes Thoreau's point d'appui, his hard bottom and rocks in place where he can set his realometer, to gauge the depth of our shams and our delusions. He needed to go outside of the village, beyond the human, to leverage his vision of social reform. Archimedes famously said, "Give me a lever and I will move the world." But where would he have stood? The fulcrum must be outside, the thing one would move. Walden was Thoreau's Archimedean point. From it and only it, that is, from the wild and only from the wild, could Thoreau move the world. Well, I also want to say a few words about that which is not wild, but the domestic. That is the Georgic in the formal literary mode. Not the pastoral retreat, but the workplace of the farm. In a recent and I think very important book by William Major, William Major points out, or calls for a new agrarianism. And as he points out, the very fact that we all eat makes us all environmentalists, ties us to the land, whether we pay attention to it or not. And given what's happening to the land, we'd better start paying attention right now. No one familiar with the Beanfield chapter of Walden can miss Thoreau's own deep involvement with this mode, with the Georgic mode, which portrays nature as we apprehend it through labor, through work on the land. So where the pastoral emphasizes leisure and draws on a nostalgia for a lost past, the equally ancient mode of the Georgic emphasizes work and draws on improving the present towards the future, a better future. So the two complement each other, as Thoreau, who also spent time at Walden hoeing and weeding those endless beans, really is trying to show us. The townsfolk rode by and they carped at him from what's now Route 126, as Thoreau tells us, "Beans? So late." Or there's the farmer who pulled up and said, "Hey, Henry, your crop will grow a lot better if you start manuring your rows." And I'm sure they had a long talk about manure. Thoreau responds in kind, "Well, what if you stopped ruining the soil by regarding it as just mere property, or worse, as just the means of acquiring property? What if instead you triangulated on that sun that looks down on our cultivated fields and on the prairies and forests without distinction? What if you were to see it as see the land, the ground, as the sacred ground of the Holy Land, and plant in it such seeds as sincerity, truth, simplicity, faith, innocence, and the like, and see if they'll not grow in this soil?" Well, Thoreau's engagement with farming was not limited to the bean field. We've lost sight today of the average Concord family's dependence on local gardens and farms. John and Cynthia Thoreau got their living from the land as well as the grocery store, and were as involved as any farmer in the land's daily and seasonal rhythms. After all, those Thoreau boarding houses needed constant provisioning. The Thoreaus especially were famous in their garden for their delicious and various melons. And it was Henry who helped the Emersons with their garden and orchard and planted the Hawthorne's bridal garden at the Old Manse. In fact, Henry was born on a farm, as those of us who've visited the beautifully restored birthhouse in Thoreau Farm are reminded today. And he was born there during that notorious year without a summer of 1817, a year which caused many local farms to crash, perhaps including the Thoreaus. Perhaps it was this that sent Father John to the city in search of another way to make a living. But his son's barbs against the farmer's groveling nature, groveling is Thoreau's word, have encouraged us, ignorant as we are about agriculture, to ignore the fact that every word Thoreau wrote has for backdrop the realities of the working farm during an era of ecological collapse and agricultural crisis when progressive and scientific farmers, many of them Thoreau's neighbors, were offering radical reforms. And I do think that Thoreau's entire career needs to be reevaluated in this light. An insight that was brought home to me after reading Brian Donahue's wonderful book, The Great Meadow. And I recently spent a few days at the Concord Free Public Library going through the minutes of the Concord Farmers Club. It's really clear, first of all, that there was a kind of informal division of labor going here. Concord's farmers would attend to the domestic stock of the town, and Henry would tend to the wild stock, but they respected each other. And that's the second point. These two parties had this genuine and mutual respect for each other's expertise. So whenever in these records, you see when questions come up about native trees or weather statistics, or the kind of thing that Henry writes about in his journal, well, the farmers go and ask Henry. And while those farmers did spend a lot of time talking about manuring fields and soiling cows, they also talked about how to plant the seeds of sincerity and truth in the youth of the town, and how to make the land around us not only useful but beautiful. I made a long pause when I came across the following words, which were spoken at the meeting on March 6, 1862, by one Albert Stacy. And he said, why should not every village have its public park from, say, 50 or 100 acres in extent, supported at public expense by the liberality of friends of horticulture? Supposing one had such a park in Concord of 100 acres in extent, comprising hill and dale and water scenery, beautifully laid out in walks and drives, a perfect arboretum of all the trees and shrubs that will grow in this vicinity, wouldn't it be the resort of this whole town? Wouldn't it be there? Wouldn't it have its silent influence upon everyone, making us all more social and genial, bringing out all the finer traits which are inert in the human character? Well, I mean, he goes on for pages, and to enthusiastic support from all these other farmers who are also there at the meeting. Well, compare Thoreau's suggestion, which at this point in 1862 was deep in the pages of the unpublished manuscript of Wild Fruits. Quote, I think that each town should have a park, or rather a primitive forest of 500 or 1,000 acres. Notice the scale enlargement from 100 to 1,000. Thoreau's thinking big. A common possession forever for instruction and recreation. All Walden Wood might have been reserved, with Walden in the midst of it, and the East Esterbrook's country might have been our huckleberry field. We boast of our system of education, but why stop at schoolmasters and schoolhouses? We're all schoolmasters, and our schoolhouse is the universe. Wow, that's cosmos. Cosmos educates us and fits us to live here by 1,000 invitations. So one of those invitations was science, and Thoreau's fascination with science was very much part of this sort of Georgic turn. For natural science is another form of labor on the land, an active intervention which plants the seeds of inquiry into the soil and nurtures the answers raised up by the sunlight of truth. So these records of the Concord farmers make clear that they were fascinated with science. And Thoreau, of course, as he's hoeing his beans, his hoe turns up arrowheads as well, which he's collecting in his attic study as part of his inquiry into the unchronicled nations of Indians who preceded Europeans on the conquered land. And a nod here to Shirley Blanky, who's trying to recover that archaeological story for us. And he gathered wild plant specimens too, and turtle eggs, which he hatched, and then he turned the little turtles loose in the wild, and birds' nests and oak galls and natural curiosities of all kinds, and even shipped some to Louis Agassiz at Harvard. Louis Agassiz, the great scientist who was one of Humboldt's proteges, another one. Thoreau tells us that he pursued his science to get to know his neighbors better, turning it to the ends, again, of that beautiful relation that joined poetry with scientific truth, so that the cosmos was envisioned not as a static and pre-existing harmony, but an ongoing labor of making harmonious, a labor of love that marries human and natural purpose, that makes cosmos into a work site, a construction project, a collaboration that emerges from physical labor on the land and political labor with each other, all directed toward building what current European theorists are calling a cosmos, that is, a good common world, meaning the best possible world, not the world that's given to us, but the world that we might attain by working together. So coming back to these diverging paths of the pastoral and the Georgic, and why I think that they both lead us astray. The first, the pastoral, has the virtue of reserving for us that free space of the imagination, that place that's separate from the working world, maybe a park designed for recreation, recreation, like the one dreamed of by the Concord farmers. A kind of poem written by the landscape to be read by all of us who walk or drive through it. But then recent critiques of wilderness have shown that the pastoral also has the vice of reserving that space apart only for those with money and the leisure and inclination to enjoy it, since it lives by excluding daily life in the working world and those who are confined by economics to the world of work. So the Georgic sets out to remedy that problem by turning the world of work itself into an ideal, where labor produces not alienation from the land or ourselves or each other, but connection